Okay, it seems that we're live again. And I want to welcome everyone to one more edition, one more episode of Dojo Live. And these are weekly talks with experts like you. And today we have a very special guest. He's got a lot of his, on his plate. You know, I'm just going to let him do the talking because he's going to be the star today. His name is John Miller. And John is currently Well, he's a man he wears many hats, but right now he's a consulting member of technical staff at Oracle. So, John, I appreciate your having agreed to be here with us today. And so, thank you. We're broadcasting live from Nearsoft's Mexico City brand new offices. And welcome, John, to today's show.
Great, thank you. And hopefully everyone can hear me okay. If you can't, just go ahead and send a message or a question, whatever you need to do, and I will see what I can do to adjust the sound.
Absolutely.
Anyways, as Carlos says, right now I'm working at Oracle. Oracle is moving into the cloud rather briskly. One of the projects that they have is something called Infrastructure as a Service. I'm working on security and also identity and access management for that. And so far it's been a pretty good time. Before Oracle, I've been a bunch of different places. I was at Amazon, I was at Google, and I spent most of my career actually at Microsoft. I was also in academia for a few years and at a Japanese industry research lab. So what I wanted to talk a bit about today is actually what it takes to be able to do a project when you don't have everybody in the same place, but instead they're distributed maybe different places in the same time zone, maybe all across the world. I was writing up some of my experience with this, and it turns out I'd actually done a lot more than I thought, starting in 1992 at Microsoft, when we were adding multimedia support to Windows NT 3.1. I was a software test developer at that point. We were putting multimedia into it. The test team was local in Redmond, Washington, but the development team was actually in the United Kingdom. And so what we had was a case where we had people separated by 8 hours, which is a little difficult for working together, trying to create something and having to work very interactively, because the developers would create new functionality, maybe get a sniff from us to make sure that it's okay to check into the main operating system branch, and then check it in, and then we would take a look at it, file a bunch of bugs, reproduce problems for them, and they would need to fix those. It can be quite difficult to communicate those things over a distance, especially way back then, which I guess we had email, but I don't think we had all the wonderful stuff with the internet that we have today. The way that British team chose to approach things was they had a full development team in the UK, but they were absolutely part of Microsoft, and they always had 2 people locally in Seattle. So what we would have is those 2 people acting as a proxy for the entire remote team, and that worked really well. The things that were remote from the Redmond site were small enough that they were able to understand how all of it fit together. They could take a look at problems we reproduced, give enough information to their colleagues back in the UK where they could fix it, and then we could all move forward. I'd say it's one of the better working relationships that I've had with remote teams, and that went on for about 1.5 years. It was a little hard on them because there were 2 things that had to happen. First, there were always 2 members of that team who were away from their family and staying in Redmond, usually for, I believe it was between a month and 6-week shift for each of them. Secondly, they had to not only be there during normal working hours in Redmond, but they also had to have a little bit of clock skew so that they could overlap with folks in the United Kingdom. And likewise, the UK folks had to adjust their schedules a little bit to make it easier to have that overlap. The key thing here was everybody was compromising to try and make sure that we could all build a good product together, and I really think that we did. I did a couple more projects that were distributed. I'll just mention them briefly. One was Internet Explorer for Unix, which you may or may not have heard of. I was working on that in 1997, again, doing test development for something called the Mainwind compatibility layer. This was a Windows compatibility layer that it was built on top of a couple of the different Unix platforms. It was actually developed in Israel rather than in Redmond. Again, I was working in Redmond with folks in Israel, and again, they had a model where a lot of the development team was in Redmond, but they had at least one proxy typically in the US. It wasn't quite as smooth as it was for when we worked with the folks in the UK, mostly because they only had one person regularly around rather than a couple, and so he had to carry the full load himself, and the way he did that was by working around the clock. So kudos to him, but I wouldn't recommend that as a long-term thing. After IE for Unix, then the next project I worked on was IP security. So I was a test developer, test lead for IP security for Windows 2000. And again, we had a case where the teams were distributed, although it was slightly different. We had a local test and development team in Seattle and remote test and development down in California. Now, this is different from the last two times because the actual development work was partitioned. It wasn't cleanly split across components. It's more that there were developers who owned subparts of things. And then the test teams had a little bit of overlap in what they covered. Now, everybody was doing their best to work together, but the lack of people moving back and forth, flying back and forth to keep in touch and to talk with each other really took its toll on this one. We found that there were lots of misunderstandings. In some cases, code had to be re-architected, or we had difficulty being able to show that something wasn't working the way that it was supposed to, difficulty agreeing on requirements, and so on. So this is a case where people weren't going the extra mile for the communication, even though we had regular sync ups. I believe we had daily sync ups plus a weekly team meeting all over the phone, but it just wasn't enough to get everybody walking the same direction at the same time. And personalities may have played a role as well, but we had personalities in the other cases without any significant problems. So what I would say is this is a way that you probably wouldn't want to do a project. You don't want to have two concentrations of people with sort of intermingled responsibilities, especially if those sets of people aren't going and communicating with each other directly. There's a lot of nuance you get out of, and bear in mind, this is back in the late 90s where we didn't really have video conferencing as something on everybody's desktop. So you're relying on telephone and email to try and understand what somebody's thinking and if they have a problem or so on. So you'd hear things in a meeting like, oh yeah, now Jeff is making a rude gesture with his right hand and shaking his head. I don't think he likes your idea. It can be very hard to get those communications across. It also leads to people being a little less civil if you don't have a face-to-face relationship. And I think this is something that's critical for any groups that are going to be working together. You have to take the time to meet up face-to-face. That means as the project's getting started, if you have people in India, you have people, in South America, you have people in North America, you all have to go and meet each other. And it's better if everybody visits everybody else's workplace rather than them just flying back, for example, to corporate headquarters. There's a certain amount of respect that shows and a certain camaraderie, as opposed to the people who are working remotely being treated as sort of implicit second-class citizens. So I did something interesting, at least to me, around 2004, which is I moved from main Microsoft into something called Microsoft Research. So they have a research arm that used to be about 1,000 strong. I think it's a little smaller now. That's primarily researchers and also a handful of developers called research software development engineers. They take care of producing prototypes and occasionally helping to integrate research results into existing products or to launch new products. In addition, they wanted to have an incubation team in Cambridge, and so I went and joined that, where we would take proven research results from the different research teams and try and find a good home for them. And as a side effect of that, I was constantly working with people in different places, mostly in Redmond, but there were also some projects that were done jointly with other branches of MSR across the world. And I went and visited other places like Egypt, for example. Cairo has a small research lab there. Went and visited there a few times. Now, the projects sort of ranged all over the map for how we organized them when I was working in Cambridge. One that probably worked the most poor was, ironically, after I moved over to the United Kingdom, there were some research results from a peer-to-peer research team there that they'd been trying to get into my old team, which was peer networking in Windows. So this is a team that I had already been a development lead and a developer on. And I was going to be the person doing the work, directly integrating the research results into that original code. You would think that would be pretty straightforward because I'd already proven I could ship code in that team. But in fact, this wound up being quite problematic. I found myself suffering, despite knowing the people, suffering from all the things that can go wrong in a distributed or remote project. For example, calling up and finding out, oh, deadlines moved and I wasn't notified somehow, and priorities are shifting. There was also something called the Longhorn reset in Windows. I don't know if people know about this, but after Windows XP and before Windows Vista shipped, I'm just trying to think how much I can say. There was a large amount of work that was done, but they took a look at it sort of in midstream after a couple years into the project and realized that they wanted to change the direction and the technology for some of that work. And so there was a big reset where lots of work got pulled out. They basically started fresh, and then they reintegrated the new things that they'd added, the ones that they felt were best suited for shipping in Vista. And it turns out one of the reasons that the folks in Redmond weren't communicating with me was because this reset was going on. If we had a good relationship, then they would have told me about that, and I would have known, for example, rather than hearing, things are quiet right now, and then a big rush, it needs to be done by this time, where this time happened to be the end of Christmas. So I worked 30 days straight in the month of December to finish development and testing of the integration, and then they ultimately wound up not taking the code that I'd integrated. And again, this is something that could have, at the very least, the work could have been avoided if we'd done a better job communicating. Or at least I could have had a heads up earlier on that this might happen. But it was what it was. It affected lots of people in Windows. But the lessons I took away for this, as far as working remotely, is even if you have prior relationships with the people you're working with remotely, there's no substitute for being on the ground. There'll be some things that they're told not to share with remote parties. There'll be some things that they are embarrassed to share, they hope won't rise to anything. One thing that you do both unconsciously and consciously when you're working with people is to filter things. So as a manager, part of your job for the people who are working for you is to try and give them some air cover so that they don't get distracted by the thought that, our group might be reorged, so that they don't get distracted by the thought that, these three other things might make our product slip, because usually 90% of that stuff doesn't come to pass. But if you kept telling people about it, nothing would ever get done. They would just sort of sit there thrashing. But anyway, that was a good lesson. Again, I needed to be traveling back more to Seattle so that I could get the feel and the vibe of things myself, and I hadn't been doing that. So that was a pretty strong lesson. And then I've got a couple more examples, but do you want me to keep talking, Carlos, or should we open it up for questions?
Oh, absolutely. Actually, what I wanted to say is that, first of all, I want to encourage the audience to send us their questions. They have there's a Q&A prompt right there on your screen if you're watching us from our website, and where it says on the lower left-hand side, there's where it says "Be part of the conversation." Just click there, and it'll take you to a Q&A prompt where you can type in your questions, and I'll read them off to John so he can respond. And so with that being said, what I would like to do right now is also, I have a couple of questions myself, but I'm not going to burn them all now, but I'd like to ask you the following, John. You were talking about geographically distributed collaboration and management, okay? And based on your experience, because you have worked with international teams in different countries and across all sorts of time zones and geographies. And my question would be this, John. What would you say that would be like is there a perceived difference between collaboration and management, especially if you're working with teams that are located, I don't know, 14 time zones away on the other side of the planet? Is there a perceived sense of collaboration or versus management? Please let me know if you need me to reword my question. I'll do so. But I
think I get it. So, and there's absolutely a difference in how things work when you're collaborating. When you have two groups that are sort of peers with each other, everybody's working together, versus you have a manager managing a remote group. So, at one point when I was working at MSR Cambridge, I moved back to the United States. And so I was living in Redmond, but I was managing people in Cambridge, working with people in Cambridge, and it was pretty rough. But we managed to make it work. We did it for more than a year. The thing that we had to do was overcome there's a certain threshold for communications in such a case, where you say, well, it's not worth picking up the phone. It's not worth making a video call. And what we did instead was we had a rule, which was if it was something we would have stood up from our seat or even just pushed back from the desk and shouted down the hall at somebody, well, then we just got in the habit of video calling. And so we'd wind up talking on video maybe, I don't know, half an hour a piece a day. But it was very much like the conversations that we'd have in offices. One thing that made it easy to put this sort of thing in place was the fact that I was the manager for these guys. And so, they couldn't say things like, well, I don't really want to do that, right? If you poll 5 people about how to do something, 2 of them are going to be like, I just want to do whatever's easiest. Another one would be like, I don't think that's going to work. And you might have, 1 or 2 people on your side for things. As a manager, you can put the right practices in place to make sure things are going to succeed. You're also monitoring everything that's happening remotely, so you can give them direct feedback. If you've got a good communication channel and you've got that direct sort of daily feedback, then it's almost indistinguishable from working next to them. And in fact, what I found was I was still going back to Cambridge regularly and visiting the people who were working for me, and they wouldn't even bother getting out of their office. They'd still just video call me. Even when we were sitting right next to each other, we'd go have lunch or whatever. But I was surprised that was the case. It really underscored how effective that was. We were able to do that because we each had our own offices. If you're an open plan, if either side is an open plan, it's much more complicated. Now, when you have peer teams working remotely, for example, when I was at Amazon, there was a team in India, which I don't know, 12 or 14-hour time difference. It's a lot from Redmond. That was working on something called WhisperSync. It's part of the Kindle functionality that keeps track of what page you're on in your book, even as you move reading books on different devices. That team is based in Chennai, India, but a lot of the development for the Kindle product is based in Seattle. And so we had there's a lot of potential for disaster there. So there we were divided up as sort of compartments doing different works. They fully owned the work they were doing on WhisperSync. And I was collaborating with them as kind of a what's called a principal engineer at Amazon, which is somebody who kind of gives feedback and says, this might be a good idea, this might not be a good idea. Oh, this has burned me 5 times in the past. Think about that before you do it. And it was a lot harder. I didn't have any direct control over them. I could influence them. I could suggest things they should do. And likewise, their manager was managing many other projects. So he didn't do a lot of directly guiding them either. And this led to misunderstandings. It led to work being done that ultimately was sometimes either delayed or discarded, since the team in Chennai was an expert on what they were doing. So they would say, this is stuff that we know has to get done. And then the people in Seattle say, no, we don't think that needs to get done. That's probably not a priority. Chennai guys would be like, oh, well, we want to do it anyways. We know we're going to need it because this sort of thing has happened 3 times in the past, and they do it speculatively. Sometimes it gets picked up, sometimes it doesn't. They also would be a little bit out of touch with the mood on the ground, especially as ship deadlines got closer, as different products are being worked on in Amazon. If there was more of a hierarchical relationship rather than a peer relationship there, I think things might have gone a little bit smoother.
Okay.
So I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it certainly does. Which leads me, as I'm listening to you, I'm led to something else, which is something that ticked in my brain, which is the word control. So, okay. So when I say control is, and this is because there are many companies out there that when they're working with remote teams, one of the major concerns, and I have witnessed this and seen this personally and directly, firsthand, is that there's no way that distributed or a remote team is going to work because I need to control. I need to control the outcome. I need to control my people. I need to control my resources. Even I cringe when I hear the word resources, and a lot of the folks that are listening and viewing us might too. But how do you overcome when, especially when you have a team that is used to being controlled? Has that ever been an issue at all in any of your projects or?
So you mean when a team is used to being controlled and they're not getting the level of guidance that they're used to?
Yes, exactly. For example, let's suppose that you have a team in, say, I don't know, Ukraine, and then they're used to being managed, used to being told what to do. Okay, they're used to being held by the hand and taken to the process until the outcome is up to satisfaction of the team manager or the project manager or the client. So
it's absolutely a problem, and it's actually one of the big sources of overhead for outsourcing or remotely managing projects, right? So when you outsource or when you remotely manage a project, what you often have is very explicit instructions and acceptance criteria, milestones, and so on. for the project to meet. You must have a beta of the functionality by 3 months from now. It must adhere to all the Pry 1 requirements. It must include at least half of the Pry 2 requirements. It should have a couple of the Pry 3 requirements satisfied as well. And what you find is it's very easy for there to be miscommunication there. So if you don't have sort of daily touch points with that team, really more than just giving them requirements, guiding them, and having a back and forth flow of information, you wind up getting 3 months or 5 months down the road, $50,000, $100,000, $150,000 spent on the development. Sometimes you outsource because it's going to be cheaper somewhere else, and then you find that you're in big trouble now because they produce something that is it's mostly following the letter of what you wrote down, but not the spirit of it. So it winds up being completely different from what you need. A team that's used to daily guidance will often do this. So if they don't have it, they will produce the wrong thing. Part of that is a specification problem on the person asking for it, because there's a shared context with all the people you're local with that you see every day that's not there for a remote party that you're trying to get to do work. So yeah, it's definitely a big problem.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. Great. John, we have a question from one of the viewers. And Luis Ortiz is asking you, actually, I'm just going to read it off to you. Do you have any experience in a flat organization or with a team with a lot of the same profiles where it's not easy to define roles? And what are some of the key points? Well, let's go to that first question. Do you have any experience in a flat organization and with a team, a lot of the same profiles where it's not easy to define roles?
So I have experience that's similar to that. What I would say is if you have relatively junior people, and since I'm 100 years old, relatively junior to me is like 10 years of experience. If you have relatively junior people who aren't used to collaborating remotely, it's just a formula for disaster. Because what you have is aggressive people on each side, aggressive, intelligent people on each side who want to be able to put their stamp on things. You have difficulty in being able to come up with agreement on things. You have difficulty in really having a common view of what that agreement is, even if you do reach it. So we say, oh yeah, well, so let's get it ready to ship on Friday, and everybody agrees, and all the teams run out and do their own thing. And everybody, since nobody wants to be the boss of anybody else, maybe, or maybe there's too many bosses and they have different directions. It's a real mess. I think one of the things that can help a distributed team work well, and that's distributed just in 2 points, or distributed like a company where everybody's working from home, you really want to have a formal structural and formal ownership. So you have to have one of those two things, either a boss who's saying what everything's going to be like, or formal ownership where they say, you own this part of the UI, and you're responsible for making sure that it fits with these 2 other boxes, and that it uses the back end correctly.
Okay, excellent. And Luis, sorry about that. I have my cell phone on. Okay, Luis's second question is, what are some of the key points on how to manage a team of such characteristics?
The first thing you have to do, so even if you have a flat organization, there's often people who are either officially or unofficially designated as technical leads, at least in the groups I've worked in. So that's been one of my roles over the last several years. And what you need to do is have that person actually go and form personal relationships with, identify key members in each place and form personal relationships with them. So I'll go and I'll look and I'll see, well, who are the, if there's a meeting, who are the 2 guys who people nod when they're talking? Not necessarily who talks the most, but who are the ones who appear to have consensus and understand the working of their area? And then those will be my go-to people for wherever I'm going. Somebody has to emerge as a leader for this. Or you have to have somebody who emerges as a leader who's not directly managing people, but draws the boundaries where it's safest for all these different people to own their pieces. You can't just have them running around willy-nilly. It's something I've seen tried time and time again at a smaller scale, even locally, and it usually causes as many problems as it solves. It's much better to have either formal organization with a reports to relationship or informal organization with a technical lead and technical leaders on each of the sides.
Okay, well, there you have it, Luis. Thank you for your questions, Luis. Luis Ortiz is a fellow near Softian. He's working out of the headquarters, like 1,500 miles away from here,
Wow.
in Hermosillo, and way north in Mexico. So thank you again, Luis. Luis, if you have any other questions, or anybody else in the audience has any other questions, please, by all means, send them to us by means of the Q&A window. Alrighty, John. Let me go back to again geographically distributed software development teams.
Mhm.
What kind of tools would you say that are ideal for for an optimal uh, cross-cultural communication, and also the risks, if any, and the takeaways as well?
So what I would say is, and the way that I'm used to operating, is typically having all of the different partners on the same network. So they have some sort of firewalled network, for example, a corporate firewalled network with different sites of that corporation. That's their own internal playground. It has protections against the outside. And then they also follow good practices for the various tools they use. Now, the things that this firewalled network provides, they'll typically have a single source repository and a single set of tools that they use for that. So the tools for producing the work product, they need to be common. Everybody has to have access to them. So you agree up front, for example, oh, we'll have a wiki. A wiki can be extremely valuable. You want to, and these days I would actually go for that more than any sort of documents. But you do want to have a document repository for things that just don't fit well in a wiki. You want to have the source code repository. You need to have a build process and a check-in process. Ideally, something that has an automated suite of tests that run against it. And here I'm mostly talking about code stuff. Should I keep talking about that or more generally?
I would say that if you can just follow the same train of thought, that would be great, because I think
Okay.
that's very, very relevant to the viewers for now. So,
So of
yeah.
course you need to have a common communication scheme, which means you absolutely want to have desktop email where you can write to each other. You want to have instant messaging, and I think it's also good to have shared text chat rooms.
Mm-hmm.
So something like IRC, where people can just sort of be in that channel in the background, and
Uh-huh.
something ideally that can put alerts on their desktop so that when something important is happening, it can pop up a little thing rather than just silently scrolling away in the background. You of course want to have not necessarily telephone, but you want to have the ability to have voice communications. Most of the projects I've worked on in the last 4 or 5 years have been open plan. And for those, people will generally go to dedicated conference rooms when they're going to communicate with each other. Even for a one-to-one conversation between somebody at one location and somebody at another, you go to a small conference room, like a breakout room, and talk there. So I'd say you absolutely want to have a breakout room. You want to have voice communications and video. For one-on-one conversations, I think video adds a lot. For group conversations, it's a little fuzzier whether it's really worth the effort of it.
Yeah.
But definitely for one-on-one, especially if you get people who work regularly with each other, the video can add a lot because you can see how much of their attention that they have. You can see little cues that would never find their way into the communication otherwise, like shrugging or anything else. It's very valuable. I've never found much use for shared editing tools. That means, for example, being able to work in Google Docs on documents and so on. If that's useful for you, it's absolutely also a good thing to do. You need to be cognizant of who's running the servers for those tools. So I wouldn't recommend, for example, Microsoft using Google Docs for their shared collaboration. They have their own products for that. And I think those are the main things that I would think of. You don't really need physical mail. You don't really need physical phones. But you want everybody to have, ideally, a laptop that they can move to have privacy. You want to have shared displays that those laptops can be hooked up to, or else dedicated computers hooked up to them. And you want to have all that support infrastructure that I was talking about.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I particularly found it interesting and amusing at the same time is the way you labeled your blog here, hypervisor virtual machine communication paper. So it's kind of cool. I mean, it's a cool name, but what is it? Why did you bring it up, or why did you create it? Why did you label it like that in the first place?
Well, so one thing that I said when I set up this particular blog was that I was going to start reading papers and posting about them. Then I promptly never did that. I posted about everything else but papers. Right now, one of the things I need to be able to do on a given physical machine is be able to have the hypervisor, which coordinates all the virtual machines on that, talk to individual virtual machines that get started up through a secure channel. And I'm investigating ways to do that. I thought that would be a no-brainer, but for KVM, which is the technology that I'm looking at right now, it turns out it's not a no-brainer. You have to have support libraries or drivers installed, and you have to kind of pick between a bunch of different choices. So one way that works for me to learn about things is to write about them after I start finding out about them. I did the same thing for my PhD work, which is I would, each time I wrote a paper, I would write up a summary of it, and that would help cement it in my mind and also position it to in relation to the other papers I was reading. Same idea here. I just want to put that up there. The problem I'm trying to solve is virtual machines being able to talk to the hypervisor without being eavesdropped on by other virtual machines, and without there being any chance of an off physical box entity being able to talk to any of those guys through that channel.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, John. By the way, before we move on to a new question from one of our viewers, I'd like to just let everyone know, in case we haven't done so, I'm going to use a very highly technical non-digital tool, which is just a post-it note. I would recommend everyone to take a look into John's blog on Quora, which is johnlmiller.quora.com. That's where you can find his piece on the virtual machine communication paper. So go there, take a look, and feast away on it. All right, we have another question, like I said, from the audience.
Okay.
Let's see. This is from another fellow Nearsoftian, Sandra Vasquez from Business Development. And she's also in our headquarters in Hermosillo, 1,500 miles away from here. She says, hold on one second. She's pinging me here and see what she's telling me also.
Don't read that question.
What? Ah, well, too late, because I'm going to read it. No, she says, have you had the opportunity... wait a minute, it's a little bit incomplete. Sandra, what kind of question is this? Systems that combine, because I think there's a missing word, Sandra, so if you care to elaborate on that, I'll appreciate it. Have you had the opportunity, systems that combine mobility and video conferencing, like Beam?
Well, I don't know Beam, but when I worked at Google...
She says, I'm sorry, I was just going to add,
okay.
What is and for you, what is the future of remote teams in terms of communication? That's the future of remote teams in terms of communication.
Okay. I think I think the future looks a lot like the present. If you talk to a visionary who may not have a very good track record of predicting the future, they'll say things like, well, we're going to be wearing virtual reality headsets, and that's going to be the way that everybody talks to everybody. So it won't matter whether they're next to you or whether they're 1,000 miles away. And I think this assumes that you're not throwing up or doing whatever else you do when you look at VR. I love VR. I don't know that it's the panacea to solve all these problems. I think remote communication is going to keep going the way they are today, which is text windows, because so much of the artifacts in our communications are more formal and clear in text. So text chat. I think we'll continue to have desktop video conferencing, although I suspect that will actually get reduced a little bit because of this movement to open plan, which, by the way, I have another blog entry saying what an awful idea open plan winds up being.
Yeah, that kind of freaks me out too, to be honest, because everything's open plan here.
Yeah, and at Google it's open plan, at Amazon it's open plan, even at Microsoft, a couple of the projects I was working on there were tending towards open plan before I left, and they're just continuing to move that direction. But yeah, I think it's going to be mostly the same things we use today. I don't think there's going to be any big change, because you need to look at a couple different things, right? Novelty is something you should just discard, because novelty only matters to get you engaged with something and for the first few days or few weeks that you use it. What you want is something that has very low friction of use and that is very clear. And the keyboard is actually really efficient for inputting text. It may be that we'll move away from keyboards and move more towards voice to text, but bandwidth being what it is these days, that can also just be straight voice to voice. Again, that's problematic in an open plan. And then people talking is one of the big culprits for the loss of productivity that you experience there. So I think it's just going to be more of the same stuff that we have today. I wish it was something else. I wish I could say it's virtual reality, but I don't. I'd almost stake my life that it's not going to be virtual reality.
Okay. Yeah. As far as virtual reality is concerned, I think I'm with you in that sense. And I say this from the non-engineering side because I'm not an engineer. But yeah, totally understand what you're saying. And the only thing I would like to add, if I may, John, is that um, uh, when you were talking about the word productivity, the way I understood it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I understood it was more along the lines of you as a project manager or someone who manages teams. But when I hear the word productivity, it's kind of like it conjures images in my brain of people cranking away at with code 8 hours a day, and kind of in a grim looking facility or something. So what would you say to those great developers who are motivated by not by the word productivity, but by the word or the term ownership, or taking ownership, becoming something part of something that's part of that project that they're working on, or to those who like to be autonomous, or to those who like just to focus on the outcome of the final product or the final code without paying attention to a whole bunch of hours that they're sitting at their tables.
Well, ultimately they have to. So in this case, are you saying if they're distracted by being in an open environment, how can they get their work done? Or do you mean that they want to be part of something bigger? They want to be part of this collaborative group and feel the buzz of like Open Plan?
Yeah, the latter. Yeah.
Okay, so it's interesting reading some of the research. There's lots of anecdotal stuff, but the research that I've read, there was something in a book called The Mythical Man Month, the second
So
edition of that.
what was that again, please?
The book's name is The Mythical Man Month. This
Oh,
is
the
one of the
mythical. Okay.
this is one of the seminal books on managing software projects. It's probably 35, 40 years old now. But there's been other editions. Anyways, they quote research in there saying that programmers who work in Open Plan, and this is back when everybody had a phone on their desk, and they might be co-located with sales folks, they actually had a productivity drop of almost 3 times. So they would be a third as productive as programmers working in offices. Things like having more space could mitigate it. One thing that I've heard time and time again justifying Open Plan is 2 things. 3 things. A better environment for collaboration, so you get to see the other people around you. You get incidentally exposed to things you would have missed otherwise, right? This sort of always-on water cooler effect, where you're getting to eavesdrop and be available to answer questions. This idea of buzz and energy, of getting everybody excited about the project and moving things forward. And collaboration. But what you find, at least what the research says, is that it doesn't say anything about buzz. I think that part is true. But it says that your accuracy and your throughput both suffer if you're in an open plan environment. And that it can be an obstacle to getting things done. It can be a distraction for people who already suffer from issues like ADHD, for example. It can cause them to be even more distracted, both by the noise, especially speech, and by visual distractions within their workspace. So I'm sure there's a happy compromise. Oh, and also illness is another side effect, at least that I saw in the research, which is people in their own offices, as soon as you move to either having them in open plan or you move to having them in shared offices, their days out of office for illness go up by a factor of between 50% and 100%. So you have many more sick days. Another thing they notice is that people who want to get work done in these great buzzy open plans, oftentimes they take a day at home. They work from home, or they go to a coffee shop, or they go someplace else to get away from everybody. And I guess my opinion is if you need to leave your workplace to get your work done, that might be something to think about when you're setting up workspaces. As far as open plan goes, the best sort of compromise I've seen has been at Google, where Google has ideally what they have is lots of open spaces, lots of breakout areas where you can go with one other person or a few other person. People are pretty good about using them, at least in the offices I was at. And the open plan area tends to be usually, at least in the office I was in, many of them were prescribed. So it'd be a room big enough just for that work team. They wouldn't be distracted by other teams and by people in other roles. It was just a set of people who were directly working together, usually say 12 or less people. And I think that was a good compromise.
Okay. John, there's something that also inevitably came to my mind, and this is as a result of what you were just saying. and the way that the outcome can be compromised because such and such distractions or some other factors. And then you also said that if you have to go elsewhere to do out of the office to do your work, then there's something probably missing or there's something wrong. That was my perception. That's what I understood.
Mhm. Yep.
Based on that, what I would like to ask now would be, what's your view on this? And I have my own thoughts about this, but I'm going to ask you first, and then and what's your personal view about the idea of the concept of work-life balance? Is it okay to separate work and life, or is it all one big thing? Is it all together? So we're getting a little bit spiritual here because we're going to talk about oneness and such, but let's just focus on that because is it can we separate it? Should we separate the two concepts, work, life, or is it just one the same thing?
Well, first I would say a lot depends on the culture that you're raised in. So I was born and raised in Alaska, which is part of the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent a lot of time around here. My dad worked hard, so that was just a very natural thing to me. Work was something that pervaded your personal life, and as a result, I like not necessarily having a clean boundary there. In the UK, on the other hand, there's a lot of people there who, and many parts of Europe, there's a lot of people there who are working because they need to bring home money so that they can live their life. It doesn't mean they don't like their work, but the work is definitely, a rung down in their set of priorities. As we, as technology marches forward with smartphones that are as powerful as computers we had 4 or 5 years ago, and people have laptops and people have tablets and they're able to borrow other equipment as they move around, I think the lines, there's potential for the lines to be blurred between personal and work life. And I think that I would say that really is a personal choice, and it's a cultural choice, both for the country that you're in and for the corporation that you're at. For example, multinational in another country is going to have a very different flavor from a local large corporation.
I
So
see.
for me personally, I like having them mixed all the time, and I still haven't figured out whether it's good or bad for work, but it certainly works for me personally.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think it does for a lot of us. And also one more thing, it's kind of tied to what we were just saying. When you're dealing, let's go back to the remote team part. You're working with a remote team a gazillion miles away. So what happens, or how do you overcome the cultural issues that may arise? For example, let's suppose that you have, let's say, a release or something that needs to be taken care of like immediately or right away or in a specific time frame. And but on the other hand, you have your remote team, and your remote team, it turns out that it's some kind of national festivity or holiday which prevents them from being able to work when you need them to work. How do you overcome that?
Well, I mean, what you do is you kick yourself in the butt for not knowing it was going to be a national holiday over there. This is one of the things that, as a manager, as a project lead, you have an obligation to do. India is a really interesting case, for example. What we find, and I'll exaggerate the numbers, but the principle is roughly the same. They might have 50 or 100 different religious holidays per year
Mm-hmm.
in India. And the way it works is given your religion or your preferences, you pick a certain subset of those to take 5 or 10. So you might find some subset of your team is out for 2 weeks at this time of year. Another subset of your team is out for a different week or two. It complicates things, and you just have to be aware of it, and you have to be able to have open conversations about when people are planning to take time off. It's not so different from dealing with vacation, especially with more senior people who get, like at Microsoft, I was getting 5 weeks a year of vacation. That can make an awfully big dent in a project, right? You have to coordinate and keep track of these things. It's just part of what you have to do for planning. And in fact, that was something that it took me a few years to catch on to, that I started putting the vacation days people were going to be out into my schedule so that people could see why it was taking X days or X months to get a particular work item done. One thing I wanted to mention, just as another thing, in case people want to ask questions about it, I've been spending a lot of time on Quora because I've done so much interviewing, both hiring people for the companies I've worked at and being interviewed to move around. I've answered an awful lot of questions about interviewing, about how to pass a technical interview, what the purpose of the interviews are, what's fair, what's not, what they might look for. if anybody has any questions about that, I'm happy to talk about recruiting or interviewing from either side of the fence.
Hey, that's definitely very relevant. I'm sure that I hope that someone from recruitment is watching us, and if not, I'm going to make sure that they get the. I mean, they're going to be able to watch this talk afterwards once it's uploaded. And so again, folks, this is John's blog on johnlmiller.quora.com, where you can also read a whole bunch of stuff that about what John's talking about. John, I have I have one more question. We're approaching the final segment, the last 10 minutes of the talk. But again, one more time, I'd like to encourage the audience to send us their questions. You can do so, as you know, by clicking on the lower left-hand side of your screen where it says "Be part of the conversation." Click there, and it'll take you to your questions and answers. And then we can read them off to John, and we'll go from there. Okay, John, I have like I said, I have one more question. This is pertaining again to the you're talking about geographically. I would like to remind the audience, by the way, that we're talking about geographically distributed collaboration and management. That's the title that's of today's talk. And in that context, the one question, the additional question that I would like to ask you, John, is the following. And this is kind of I'm challenging you, or I'm prompting you to give us a to help us a little bit here with some hints, because what has been like the greatest or most difficult situation or challenge that you have encountered when dealing with a remote team, and how did you overcome it? Do you have an anecdote to share with us, John?
Sure, it may be a little long. So one of the projects I worked on while I was at Microsoft Research, and this is when I was living in the UK, was something called the Microsoft Touch Mouse. So this is it's like the Apple Magic Mouse. It's got a touch sensor built into the mouse itself. It started out as a research collaboration between Redmond-based and Cambridge-based research teams, and then they decided to move it into being a product. Now, the part of the product that we were working on in Cambridge was the touch tracking and the gesture recognition. And we had a relationship where very clearly the main code was owned by the hardware team in Redmond. And we were going to provide something that would slot into it. But we kept bumping into problems where it just wasn't working very well. You know, we'd produce something and we'd hear a lot of sort of concern about things. I'm a big proponent of traveling and actually seeing people in person. I mean, I wish it didn't work this way. I wish you could just have a video conference in a conference room or daily video chats or something and have that be enough, but it's just not. What I found was, so there were some rumblings of possible trouble. I went out for a visit and found that actually those rumblings, even though nobody had told me anything formally, just talking to a few friends I had on the team, people were extremely concerned about the work we were doing. In fact, they were thinking about cutting it all together. You know, maybe they would have done it locally in Seattle. Maybe they would have canceled the project. And this is a project that, I don't know, if you add everybody up working on it, might be 100 person working over a couple of different years. It's a fair-sized project. So the way that we handled that is I went and I spent a fair amount of time in Seattle, and then for other reasons I wound up moving back to Seattle. Seattle and Redmond are right by each other, by the way. And walking around the halls, I got office space actually sitting with these guys, and I sat there and I listened to them talk, and I hobnobbed at the water coolers and whatever else in between things. And I found out why people were having these doubts and why they weren't expressing them. And then I went and reassured them. And when it called for talking to a group, I would talk to a group and explain, here's what the gesture recognizer does, here's why it's a problem, here's how we're going to fix it. You don't need to be worried. And that went a long ways towards making everything move smoothly. But again, it takes one of the sides doing something exceptional to enhance communications and to make sure that everybody is comfortable with where things are going.
Okay, excellent. Well, I guess that there's still a lot to learn from you, John, and I believe that you have a wealth of experiences and things you can share with our audience. But unfortunately, we're almost approaching the final minutes of this conversation, And what I would like to ask you one more time, I mean, finally, would be: is there? I'd like you to encourage you to send our viewers, who are mostly software engineers, what kind of advice would you give them if they want to work with optimal circumstances, either with their own teams, local teams at the office, or with their counterparts who might happen to be halfway across the world, or 2 hour flight. So regardless of that, what's the best piece of advice you would like to give these young folks based on your experience of your years of experience with Google, Amazon, and the like?
Well, I'll try and squeeze a whole bunch of advice in a relatively short period.
Yeah.
First of all, I would say you need to factor in that there's got to be people flying and meeting each other and collaborating, and it needs to be two-way, not just one way. Also, if there's different time zones involved, somebody's going to be getting screwed out of their sleep. It's just the way it works. So the way it's worked best in the past for the projects I've been on is for that to be asymmetrical. In other words, one team is giving a lot more than the other team in terms of working off hours and dealing with this time shift. And ideally, that should be either the smaller team or the more remote team. You need to plan for that too. You want to have strong leadership in place, and you want to have enough on-ground communications between the different places where people are working remotely that that you don't have these bad feelings that build up without getting addressed and resolved. Sometimes all it takes is asking the right questions that nobody wants to ask, but could come up organically if you are in the same place as the folks that you're talking to. And then finally, I would say make sure that you've got good shared tools that you can use, a way to be able to do text chatting, a shared source repository, a set of common tools for building things, a single place people can pick up the latest build, good automated tools that will pick up problems at check-in, not just later. Because it's going to be very expensive if you have something like a build break at the end of one side's day that the other side of the project has to live with all day long until those folks are back. I'd say those are the main pieces of advice.
Excellent, excellent, and they're very much appreciated, John. Okay, well, folks, we're about to wrap up, and I want to thank John Miller for having agreed to be here with us today to share his insights, experience, and pretty much everything that John has enlightened us today with. And John, you're going to be, like I said at the beginning of our chat before we went on the air, you're going to be getting one of these.
Awesome.
So it's kind of cool. It's a metal cup with our logo. You're going to get this and a few other things pretty soon. So you and I are going to be in touch with that. So here it is. And in case there's anyone out there who's watching us and wants to be a speaker, you're going to get one of these. Eventually, we'll get to a point where we can pay you guys for your time, but we're not yet there yet. But John, I really appreciate it from the bottom of my heart for your time, and we're going to be in touch. And I look forward to having you again sometime in the near future. And thank you so much, and thank you, our audience as well.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show, Carlos.
Absolutely, our pleasure. All right, guys. Thanks a lot, and thank you for having watched one more episode of Dojo Live from Nearsoft, Mexico City. Thanks, everyone. You have a wonderful day.